What's going on? Today I'm going to be comparing the brand new RF-S 10 to 18mm f4.5 to 6.3 with the older EF-S version of this lens to find out which one of these is the best ultra-wide lens for crop sensor R-mount cameras like the R50, R100, R10, and R7. Now I don't want to waste your time, I'm going to jump right into this video, but if this does help you out, please consider dropping a like and subscribing and maybe checking out my merch down in the description. Alright, so first off I'm going to compare the physical differences and specs between these two lenses, and then I'm going to jump into a more technical comparison like sharpness, vignetting, and distortion, things like that. So first off, physically the biggest difference between these, you can see right now, is the size difference between these two lenses. So with the brand new RF-S lens, you can see how small this is. It fits right in the palm of my hand here, and this is when it's kind of compacted down. So when you actually decide to use this lens, you have to kind of turn it over to unlock it from this into the actual usable part of this lens where it kind of sticks out a little more. But it's really cool that for storage and things like that, you can kind of turn it over and lock it in place here, and it'll be even smaller than it already is. So this lens comes in at 5.3 ounces, and it's just over 2 inches long. So this is an absolutely tiny lens. It weighs nothing. You barely even notice this on a camera, especially if you have something like the Canon R7. You literally won't even notice the weight of this lens on your camera. So this lens is ultra small and portable, and one of the reasons why I absolutely love this lens. But keep in mind that with that, you kind of get rid of some things like, great build quality and, metal build and things like that you'd get in higher end, heavier lenses. All right, and then for the EF-S version of this lens, this comes in at just under 8.5 ounces without this adapter. But the thing is, you're always gonna need this adapter if you're going to use these lenses on an RF mount camera. So everything I talk about will be with this adapter included, which makes this lens quite a bit bigger than the RF-S version. So this weighs a little bit more than 8.5 ounces with the adapter, and also comes in at just under 4 inches, so almost double the height of the RF-S version. But to be honest, when I'm holding both of these, they're both so light that the weight really isn't even an issue with the EF-S version. Both of these are extremely light lenses, but the size is really the main difference between these. This is quite a bit longer. It's going to be a little bit more front heavy in your camera. It's going to take up more room in your camera bag, especially if you compact this down. The EF-S version is definitely a bigger and bulkier lens. Now also, the EF-S version is a 10 to 18mm f4.5 to 5.6, and the RF-S version is a 10 to 18 f4.5 to 6.3. So on the more zoomed in 18mm side, the maximum aperture on the RF-S version is slightly slower, one full stop slower than the EF-S version, which means when you're zoomed into 18mm, you're gonna have slightly less low light performance with this lens, as well as slightly less background separation. But 4.5 to 5.6 versus 4.5 to 6.3 isn't really a substantial difference, and they're both still an f4.5 when you're at the widest 10mm focal length. And then both of these are IS STM lenses, which means both of these lenses have image stabilization built in, which is great to see. And they both have STM focus motors, which aren't Canon's highest end USM focus motors, but both of these have fantastic autofocus. I would say the RF-S version is slightly faster, but I think in the real world when using these lenses, you just really won't notice much of a difference in terms of autofocus performance. However, another thing to mention is the EF-S older version here has these switches for autofocus and manual focus, as well as for stabilization, turning it on and off. I really like to see these physical switches to easily switch between manual and autofocus, and to easily be able to switch on and off your stabilization. But the RF-S version doesn't have any buttons or any switches on the entire lens. So in order to switch from manual to autofocus, you have to jump into your camera menu with this lens. And same goes for stabilization. It's just going to be a little bit easier with the EF-S version with these switches to just easily switch around your settings. But when it comes to the actual specs of the stabilization, both of these are the exact same. They can both provide up to 4 stops of stabilization. Alright, next up you can see the front elements of both of these lenses are very different sizes, which means the thread sizes on these lenses are different as well. The RF-S version here has a 49mm filter thread, while the EF-S version has a 67mm filter thread. That's not really a pro or con to either of these, they're just different size filter threads. But speaking of front elements, the close focus distance is a huge difference between these. So even with the EF-S version, you can get pretty close to your subjects while keeping them in focus, which is really useful to have in a lens. But the RF-S version takes this even further, and if you switch it into manual focus mode, you can legitimately focus on something that is all the way against the glass element of this lens. I am so glad to see that in this lens, just adding that extra use case to this lens, getting those like macro style ultra wide shots. And so for the physical differences between these lenses, that's pretty much all I have. Now it's time to move into the technical differences between these, like sharpness, vignetting, distortion, things like that. And spoiler alert, one of these definitely pulls ahead of the other one. But let's get into it. All right, now it's time to compare things like sharpness, flaring, contrast, vignetting, things like that. So I'm gonna hop on my computer here and take a look at those, but I'm also filming on the RF-S 10-18 right now. And this is at 10 millimeters, so you can see how wide this lens is, and I can zoom all the way into 18 right here. But either way, let's get into the more technical comparison between the EF-S and the RF-S 10-18. All right, for the RF lens at 10 millimeters, the center is surprisingly sharp. Like it's quite sharp, even wide open. So I stopped it down all the way to f11 and the sharpness didn't seem to change at all in the center. And so that's really good to know, especially since these are fairly slow lenses, you know, being f4.5 is your max aperture at 10 millimeters. I like to see that you don't need to stop down any further to get the sharpest possible image, at least in the center of the screen, like, you know, where you see me at right now. If we're doing something like this, you're seeing me pretty much as sharp as you're going to, even though I'm wide open at f4.5 right now. Now, if you move over to the corners on the RF lens, they are pretty soft and stretched, you can see. I mean, there's quite a bit of distortion in the very corners of this. Now the corners seem to sharpen up a little bit up until f8, and then they soften back up at f11. So if you want the sharpest possible corners, and I'd say, you know, overall image, it looks like f8 is about where you're gonna get overall across the entire image, the best possible, sharpest image out of this lens. And so that was all at 10 millimeters. But if we zoom into 18 millimeters, which is the most zoomed in you can get with this lens, the center is also very sharp again, and it doesn't seem to sharpen up at all when it's stopped down, just like at 10 millimeters. So that's pretty much the same across the board. And then for the corners at 18 millimeters, kind of the same thing goes. It sharpens up a little bit from wide open till f8, and then softens back up at f11 again in the corners. So then for sharpness, if we go ahead and move over to the older EF-S lens, also at 10 millimeters, the EF-S lens is pretty sharp wide open. You know, you're definitely not gonna have to worry about center sharpness while you're shooting wide open at all. It's not gonna be something you're gonna have any issues with. But it does seem to sharpen up a little bit until f8, and then after 8, the image starts to soften up in the center. So you really want to keep this lens, you know, between wide open and f8 for the best possible sharpness, especially in the center. And then for the corners, again, the corners are really soft. They're really stretched with this lens as well. With the EF-S lens, it looks like at least at 10 millimeters, when you stop down, the corners seem to stretch even more. I'm not really sure why. It could be maybe the digital stuff that Canon's doing in their lens profile, but from my testing, the corners stretch out even more when you stop down. And then at 18 millimeters, it's again sharp wide open in the center, and it doesn't really sharpen up when you stop it down, at least in the center. And then at 18 millimeters, the corners seem to sharpen up all the way until f11. But yeah, overall for sharpness, you know, they're very similar. You can't really go wrong with either of these lenses. But I would say the RF-S does beat it, which makes sense because it's a substantially newer lens. So it's not surprising that you're gonna see slightly better sharpness out of the newer lens. But you really can't go wrong with either of these when it comes to sharpness overall. They're both pretty decent. Now for vignetting, the RF-S lens has noticeably more vignetting than the EF-S version. However, most of the time this is pretty fixable. You can fix that in something like Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop, or even like on your phone. You could fix issues like vignetting pretty easily. Both of these have pretty similar flaring. They don't control it exceptionally well, but the RF-S definitely controls it better than the EF-S. It's a little bit less overpowering and extreme, but both of these lenses aren't going to be deal breakers when it comes to flaring, just ruining the image or anything like that. And again, neither of them perform exceptionally well like L-series lenses would. But I would say overall, the RF-S is slightly better and it handles flaring just slightly better than the older EF-S version, which again makes sense because this is a substantially newer lens. All right, so in conclusion, I'll let you make up your mind on which lens is the right one for you, but it looks like if you own an RF camera, the RF-S version is definitely the better purchase pretty much 100% of the time. I mean, it's just overall slightly better in almost every aspect. It's a lot smaller, a lot lighter. You don't need an adapter. If you're planning on purchasing one of these two and you just don't know which one to choose, I would pick the RF-S version 100% of the time. However, if you are looking maybe at upgrading your EF-S version, again, I'll let you make the decision based on what you saw. I don't think it's really worth an upgrade, but it's definitely worth picking the RF-S version over the EFS version. So there we go, that wraps up this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider dropping a like and subscribing if this video helped you out, and I will see you in the next video.